please join me in giving a warm round of applause to Dr. Stefan Lund.
Let's see, can everyone hear me okay, or do I need to raise this up a bit? Yeah, okay. There we go. I think this is probably going to do the trick. Okay, is that better? Yeah, okay, cool. All right, as you'll hopefully excuse me if I did not have as grave a run-in as Dr. Manning's child did, but I am still recovering from a bit of an illness, so you will forgive any coughs or my liberal use of water. And as Tom said, I did not have to come far as Boston or anywhere else. I am, like Manning, a avid baseball fan. I may not, I may look a lot young to most of you, but I do remember the Metrodome, and I do remember when you could go to when I could go to the Metrodome on Wednesday evenings for $1 a dog night. I know, get a bleacher ticket and 2 hot dogs for $10. It's amazing, to be 12 years old again. But as baseball aside, as Tom said, what I want to talk to you. Still working on. What I want to talk to you guys about today, in both my talks, really, is the road to the Civil War. What actually took us there, and there's a lot of places you could learn that sort of information. And so, with this particular presentation, I want to highlight an element of the road to war for the Union that I find particularly interesting, and perhaps convince you that there's an underappreciated side of it, and that is, as the title says, how people's ideas about free speech played into this. Because one of the challenges that I experienced when I first started really diving into the Civil War, well over a decade ago, and one that I think that many people that study this period run up against, is what drove the Unionists to war. The rebel motivations are pretty easy to grasp, and we'll talk about them this afternoon. They're supporting an independent polity that they hope will preserve slavery. The Union cause could be a bit more nebulous for the modern history lover. Union doesn't have the same political salience for us as it did to Americans from the 19th century. It can be hard to really empathize with the regional differences that Americans of the past felt so acutely. And it can be challenging to reckon with the real threat of the breakup of the country that they felt when we've lived in a country that's been reunited for a century and a half. And so I want to try to offer a partial answer to this question, what drove the Unionists to war, by focusing on Americans' perceptions of free speech, freedom of the press, and the First Amendment. And specifically, I want to explore how Americans of the northern states came to view the South as an alien, un-American, almost uncivilized place, where the vaunted American liberty of freedom of expression had been trampled. This belief, I think, led to important shifts in their mindset, to seeing Southern leaders as analogs to the haughty autocrats of the old world that the United States was supposed to oppose, and to see the common Southerner as a poor, misguided soul who sinned against his country because he knew not what he did. This all, I think they partially thought, it was due to the censorious oppression of Southern leaders. In short, I want to convince you that arguments over the role of free speech in the United States help explain how Americans came to see each other as an other in the years leading up to the war, and how Northerners really went about fighting some of the early battles of the war. Now, there we go. Visitors to the antebellum U.S. found Americans' passion for newspapers in particular, newspapers and news, to be one of the most astonishing and perplexing peculiarities of American culture. As an example, in 1817, the Portuguese diplomat José Correia de Serra wrote to his king back in Portugal, trying to explain the odd people that he found on this side of the Atlantic. He wrote, quote, "This may seem strange or even ridiculous to your excellency, but Americans are a nation that spends its life reading voluminous newspapers. In fact," Correa explained, quote, "those newspapers are the primary mode of governance." And it concluded, quote, "Thank God you do not have to deal with a democratic republic." It wasn't just a Sarah. We all, Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville, the French emissary, is the most well-known foreign visitor to America at this time, and he agreed, saying, in the United States, there's almost no small town that does not have a newspaper, and concluded, quote, "The press exercises an immense power in America." And so many Americans would have happily agreed that their commitment to publishing and reading made them exceptional. Americans of the 19th century regarded freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the more general freedom of expression as foundational to the American legal and cultural ethos. It was part of what made Americans Americans. This is not to say that this was a utopia of free expression. Americans believed in all sorts of limits on freedom of speech. They believed that these were justified when free expression started to pose a danger to society as a whole. But what's important is that Americans believed this about themselves and their country, that their commitment to the principle that people should be able to think or speak or write their thoughts without the interference of government was part of what made them uniquely free. And now, if you believe yourself to be unique, one might even say exceptional, it helps to have something to compare yourself to, a negative example that you can point to and say, we're not like them, we're different. And for many 19th century Americans, a key point of reference was Europe, the old world where emperors and nobles governed by right of birth rather than merit, and they enforced a variety of censorship laws meant to stymie criticism of church and state. In a speech in 1835, the Presbyterian minister John Breckinridge compared the vaunted freedoms of the United States with the autocratic regimes of Europe, writing, "What do the rights of man mean in Vienna or St. Petersburg? What does freedom or liberty of the press mean in Rome? Our freedom is our peculiarity as it is our glory." For Americans like Breckinridge, it was their republican liberty represented by their government's guarantees of free speech and press that made American civilization different, better than their European contemporaries. Americans like Breckinridge imagined their country as a stark contrast to European nations in a number of important categories. Where Europe was dominated by autocracy and monarchy, the United States was governed by Republican representatives, democratically elected. Where French, Italians, Germans, and Russians were still enthralled to conservative old religions that stressed hierarchy and superstition, American Protestants were reasonable men who read the Word of God for themselves and bowed to no bishops. Where Europe was a land of violence, where kings sent their subjects to slaughter and revolutionaries plotted to seize power, America was a land of conservative, temperate men who sought only to preserve the peace and liberty that their fathers' generation had won for them. To be clear, this is a mythology. But it's a powerful mythology, a sort of civic religion that explained Americans' place in the world as a sort of chosen people. Americans who subscribed to this mythology believed that they had taken up Thomas Paine's call to begin the world over again, that they'd forged a new nation that would lead the way forward to progress and liberty. So, if American liberty is what makes the United States exceptional and virtuous, well then it stands to reason that any American who abrogated that liberty was almost by definition an enemy worthy of condemnation. And it's, again, like I said, it's not like everyone at this time was some sort of free speech absolutist. As I said, almost everyone agreed that there were certain obvious limits on freedom of expression. However, as any of you who have ever discussed the First Amendment with anybody have probably noticed, one person's obvious limits are frequently another person's tyrannical overreach. And it was common for antebellum state constitutions to include a provision that announced that citizens had a right to free speech, free expression, freedom of the press, but they were responsible for, quote-unquote, abuse of the right. In Ohio, New York, Louisiana, among others, carried these similar provisions in their constitutions. And so, in the 1830s, as abolitionists, the American Anti-Slavery Society began publishing abolitionist literature and attempting to distribute it in southern states. Southern states quickly passed laws banning abolitionist material and imposing harsh penalties for any violations. Those found distributing abolitionist literature in Virginia could be imprisoned. In Missouri, they could be imprisoned for life. In Alabama, they could theoretically be executed. Abolitionists cried foul, claiming Southern slaveholders were denying them freedom of expression. The Southern slaveholders, on the other hand, saw these new laws as entirely in keeping with the free speech principles outlined in their constitutions. Free speech does not cover dangerous or immoral speech, which is exactly what they believed abolitionism was. Now, to be clear, these laws are rarely enforced. They did their job of scaring abolitionists away or, getting them to shut up. They did that job pretty well. But the enactment of these laws in the first place, across the South, and these were pretty much ubiquitous, had a profound impact in the coming decades. Because Northerners saw them do this. And in the coming years, they would reference this legal regime to prove that Southern slavery would brook no criticism, that Southern elites were determined opponents of freedom of speech and would sacrifice anybody's right to think or speak or write if it helped them preserve their slave system. Now, conflicting interpretations of what free speech meant, and specifically where slavery was concerned, these came to a head in 1836. Because, many abolitionists conceded that Congress had no constitutional justification to abolish slavery wholesale in states where it already existed. Congress does have authority over interstate commerce. It does have authority over federal territories. And so this meant it could potentially still disrupt slavery. Anti-slavery societies across the North began sending petitions to Congress, bearing signatures from their communities, asking that Congress limit or abolish the slave trade in general and slavery in Washington, D.C. in particular. Now, many of these authors of these petitions, as well as their signatories, were women, and they intentionally leveraged both their supposed innate female sense of morality and the form of a petition itself to challenge lawmakers, to heed their wisdom on the moral issue of slavery, while still maintaining the rhetorical position of a supplicant bearing a humble petition. Southern lawmakers were aghast at this denunciation of their hallowed traditions and quickly imposed what came to be known as the gag rule. The gag rule was not a law, it was simply a rule of congressional procedure that required that any petition on the subject of slavery be immediately tabled and not discussed, effectively consigning the petitions to a legislative black hole where they could never escape nor see the light of day. Now, this gag rule rankled some Northern lawmakers. However, specifically because it seemed like a clear violation of the First Amendment. We, today, modern folks, when we think of that amendment, we usually think of it as guaranteeing our right to follow our own conscience when it comes to important subjects like religion and politics. But it also includes a key provision that, quote, Congress shall make no law abridging the right of the people to petition the government for redress of grievances. Petitioning was understood as distinct from other political acts, such as voting. It could be practiced by any member of the community, regardless if they held certain political rights or not. consistent with long-standing practice that they inherited from English law. Congress had in the past received petitions from all manner of people who did not enjoy full political rights, including Indians, immigrants, African Americans, and women. The former president, now Congressman John Adams, spent the next 8 years holding slaveholders' feet to the fire over their support of the gag rule. While he himself supported this gradual emancipation, Adams insisted that, as a matter of free speech, in accordance with the First Amendment, all abolitionists must have their petitions heard in Congress. Quote, "The right to petition belongs to all," he declared. And he denounced his Southern colleagues' gag rule for violating, quote, "my right of freedom of speech as a member of this House." The gag rule had to be readopted with each new session of Congress. And so for the better part of 10 years, Adams railed against the reimposition of this ban on American free expression. And Northern political observers were reminded repeatedly of how Southerners trampled on free speech in order to protect slavery. Even Northerners who bore little sympathy for the enslaved and maintained the common white supremacist attitudes of that time recoiled at the notion that the rights of white Americans were being abrogated for the sake of Southerners' slaves. Now, as Adams began his campaign against the congressional gag rule, the United States was rocked by a shocking event that highlighted for many just how far Southerners were willing to go, just how hostile they were to freedom of the press. Because beginning in 1833, the Presbyterian minister, Elijah Lovejoy, had run a newspaper out of St. Louis in Missouri, a slave state. And in this newspaper, he harshly condemned a lot of things. He was a pretty virulent anti-Catholic, for one. But the thing that got him in trouble in Missouri was his criticism of slavery. And by 1837, he had begun to fear for his safety operating such a paper in a slave state. And he moved his operation right across the Mississippi River to the town of Alton in Illinois. He found it difficult to continue publishing, however, because pro-slavery gangs kept wrecking his printing press and the municipal authorities refused to help him. Therefore, when Lovejoy ordered a new printing press shipped to town, he and several of his friends armed themselves and stood guard over the warehouse next to the river where the press sat. A mob of pro-slavery Missourians arrived, determined to destroy the press once again, and threatened the lives of Lovejoy and his friends. A scuffle broke out, shots were fired, and Lovejoy fell dead, shot in the chest. Lovejoy's murder sent shockwaves through the North, as such that John Quincy Adams actually compared the news of his death to an earthquake. The author Wendell Phillips and revolutionary John Brown both cited Lovejoy's death as the cause of their conversion to abolitionism. In one of his first known speeches, Abraham Lincoln, at that point barely younger than me, condemned Lovejoy's killers and the quote-unquote mobocratic spirit of modern America, warning that if Americans did not disavow this type of violence, their country would, quote, die by suicide. Lovejoy was quickly adopted as a martyr, not just to the abolitionist cause, but to the cause of freedom of the press in general in the United States. For example, the congregation of the First Colored Presbyterian Church lauded Lovejoy's commitment to give his life for, quote, liberty of the press and the holy principles of abolition. Black newspaper editor and abolitionist Samuel Cornish declared that the murder made mockery of Illinois' commitment to the, quote, principles of American liberty. Mob violence and threats against persons who violated community norms, these weren't uncommon in 19th century America, but murder was still considered beyond the pale. As southern states passed more draconian limits on abolitionist speech, and Adams railed against the gag rule, Lovejoy's murder stood as a stark symbol of just how far Southern elites would go, Southerners in general would go, to silence their critics. Now, while these events of the 1830s are worrisome, it was really only with the outbreak of violence in Kansas during the 1850s that the Northerners began to connect these disparate events into a larger narrative in which Southern slaveholders played the part of unenlightened enemies of free speech. More than anything is the passage of the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act and the subsequent battles on the Great Plains that drove Northerners to see their Southern neighbors as enemies. And I say this because, well, anti-slavery Northerners and Black Americans had been sounding the alarm bell of slavery for years. It was the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the subsequent Southern violence that really began to convince more middle-of-the-road white Northerners, for whom slavery often wasn't that salient of an issue, began to convince them that slaveholders were a real threat to American freedom. The violence that followed the Kansas-Nebraska Act solidified for many Northerners that Southern slaveholders represented a barbaric threat to their liberty. An essential proof of Southerners' violence, their aim to silence freedom of speech and the press, came in May of 1856. A pro-slavery jury in Kansas produced an indictment of two newspapers published in the Free Soil town of Lawrence, the Herald and the Free State. The grand jury recommended their abatement as nuisances. That is, they declared that these newspapers were harmful to public order and should be removed or destroyed. And so the day after this indictment came down, former U.S. Senator David Atchison led a band of pro-slavery Missourians to Lawrence, where they destroyed numerous buildings, dumping the printing presses of the Herald and Free State into the Kansas River and scattering their movable type in the streets. What became known as the Sack of Lawrence was immediately denounced as an outrage across northern states. The targeted nature of this violence, the spectacular destruction of the press in Lawrence, sent a deliberate message. You might think you have the right to criticize slavery, but think again. Only days afterwards, Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner denounced the Sack of Lawrence in a speech in Congress, comparing white Southerners' devotion to slavery to violent lust. But for the crime of speaking against slavery, and insulting his cousin in the process, South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks attacked and viciously beat Sumner with a cane, while Sumner sat trapped under his Senate desk. Brooks rained blows on Sumner until his cane broke in a brutal and flagrant display of retributive violence. In the words of the historian Elizabeth Barron, Northerners saw the attack on Sumner as a, quote, window into the Southern soul. Rather than being ostracized and condemned, Brooks received praise and acclaim from public voices in the South. It seemed many that Southerners agreed. Southerners in general agreed that Northern representatives, and by extension, Northerners more generally, had no right to speak when it came to slavery. It was one thing to pass egregious laws, punishments for establishing a speech in your own state, but now Southerners clearly believed that it was their right to enforce these same rules on Northerners with violence, if necessary. Now, for many Northerners, the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the violence that followed was galling because it demonstrated, I think I went a bit too far. It was galling because it demonstrated that their Southern countrymen did not view them as equal members of the Union. The act itself had repealed the Missouri Compromise, a keystone of sectional compromise for a generation, in order to open land for slave settlement that had been previously guaranteed as free soil. And as we've seen, Northerners criticized Southerners' violent behavior, and when they did so, they were met with condemnation, assault, destruction. It was no longer just the anti-slavery press that identified slaveholders as a threat to the freedom of white Americans. One self-described conservative theologian denounced slaveholders as, quote, as a, quote, aristocracy, which has planted its foot upon our necks. He argued that only by opposing them could Americans, quote, make this nation again, in reality, a republic. Some critics pointed specifically to Southern attacks on free expression to support their claim that Southerners had betrayed American freedom. For example, the newspaper, the Boston Atlas in Boston, it's been a pretty firm defender of compromise with the slave South. But it now changed its tune, writing, quote, "We find in this nation a power which little by little has aggrandized itself until it has become a despotism. It mobs and it shoots, tars and feathers, hangs and rips open mailbags. It imprisons travelers, bullies Congress, debauches the courts. It is a power which sweeps away the serenity of law and order and substitutes in its place brawling anarchy and sanguinary semi-civilization." The words they use are telling. You know, if the Union is supposed to be a place of peace and order, where reason and meritocracy prevail, these slaveholders have come to represent the very opposite to Northerners. Slaveholders were an anti-republican aristocracy, a despotism that had introduced brawling anarchy. You know, it's their fault that there's bloodshed in the American Eden. Now, for their part, Southern slaveholders also associated abolitionists with un-American foreign threats. Abolitionists, they said, were senseless fanatics, radicals, who, like the French Jacobins, spoke the language of liberty, but intended to bring only turmoil and bloodshed. One Virginia lawyer attributed Nat Turner's 1831 enslaved rebellion to, quote, "the damnable spirit of fanaticism engendered by Northern publications." Another white Southerner denounced the signatories of anti-slavery petitions as, quote, traitors not to their country, but to the whole human race. Jefferson Davis, Mississippi senator and future rebel leader, compared abolitionists specifically with foreign socialists. He wrote, quote, "the power to dictate what sort of property the state will allow the citizen to own and work is tyrannical. The European socialists are the correspondents of the American abolitionists and maintain the same doctrine as to property. He who has property, they argue, is the robber of him who has not." Slaveholders constantly reference the history of recent decades, the reign of terror in France, the revolution in Haiti, to bolster their arguments that it was Northern radicals who were, in truth, the true threats to the Republic. Anti-slavery Northerners had their explanations of why Southerners reacted to violence when slavery was criticized. They explained these hostile outbursts as the natural product of the draconian laws that slaveholders had passed to restrict anti-slavery speech in their own states. Having forced their own citizens into submission, they now had to turn their sights on Northerners who still enjoyed the right to speak freely. As the anti-slavery writer George Melville Weston declared that slaveholders could only maintain power by, quote, "a reign of terror which has muzzled the press and silenced free speech." Weston saw in slaveholder violence an attempt not just to shut Northerners up, but to usurp the American Republic itself. In the words of another concerned Northerner, quote, "if the slave power succeeds, well, farewell to liberty. All hail instead a military dictator, and finally, a monarchy." Republican Senator Benjamin Wade also associated slaveholders with an imagined international cabal that threatened America with aristocracy and despotism. Slaveholders represented a nefarious power, he argued, which, quote, "reigns and domineers over the people of the South, which rules them with a rod of iron, which gags the press, which restrains the liberty of speech." In the eyes of Republican Southern slaveholders' obvious desire to control what was said and written about slavery revealed their lust to enslave not only their black laborers, but common Southerners as well, white Southerners as well. This was the rhetoric that Republicans used to break into the Northern political mainstream, emphasizing the harm that slavery supposedly did to white Southerners. Republicans argued that slavery was an inefficient economic system that offered little economic gain, little opportunity for economic prosperity for non-slaveholders, and produced a political regime that restricted their essential rights to free speech. It's that last point that explains why white Southerners couldn't realize the trap they had been caught in, to break the clutches of slavery. Because with criticism of slavery outlawed in the South, Republicans argued, Southern whites with no personal stake in the institution could be effectively bamboozled by the slaveholding class into supporting a slave labor system that they had no stake in. When secession eventually came, these sorts of beliefs guided Northern leadership in their decisions to both go to war and how to handle the rebels once the conflict had begun. Specifically, many in the Northern government and press assumed that a vast majority of white Southerners were not at heart traitors and rebels, that they had been deceived to acting against their own interests and betraying the country they loved through a decades-long slaveholder campaign of censorship and pro-slavery misinformation. It naturally followed, therefore, that if the slaveholders' lies could be revealed, that is, if free speech could be restored to the South, the Southern yeomanry would recoil at the truth, realize that they had been duped, and join the Unionist cause in casting down the slaveholding class who had betrayed the Republic. On one hand, this is, an incredibly common form of self-rationalization, right? My enemies are not truly my enemies. They're only deceived by wily agitators. Once they come to understand the truth, surely my rivals will agree with me, right? But, as I've outlined over the last half hour or so, this rationalization was grounded in Republicans' understanding of recent history, of what they understood to now be a decades-long pattern of violent suppression of anti-slavery speech in the American South. Without access to a full range of ideas on the righteousness of slavery, of course the common Southerner could be misled. Without an understanding of how truly invested, without Republicans, that is, understanding how truly invested white Southerners of all classes actually were in the racial hierarchy of their society, of which slavery was a central part, many Northern leaders assumed that once the slaveholder influence was removed, most Southern whites would reject slavery, as many Northern whites had. I've been mixing the terms Republican and Northern a bit too much here, but part of that is that the logic I'm outlining here is essential to the political rhetoric of the Republican Party. It was essential to them because it was effective at gaining votes in the North. It dovetailed with what many Northerners already believed. In the first months of the war, George McClellan, himself no Republican, used similar language in his official communications, language that indicated that he saw Southern whites as innocent parties to the rebellion. McClellan reported to Washington in July of 1861 that the generous surrender terms he had just offered were calculated to impress the, quote, deluded mass of rebels as being magnanimous. In a public declaration, he declared that he expected to find friends in Virginia, among all Virginians, really, except, quote, those who have fallen victim to the most insane prejudices and who will no longer hear the voice of reason. McClellan's rhetoric indicates that he, at least publicly, he considered white Southerners to have been wronged by the slave power and the secessionist movement. They were the deluded victims. The only non-slaveholders who supported secession must be those who were too prejudiced to be beyond reason. It was this type of thinking that helped guide the conciliatory policy of McClellan and others in the early months of the conflict. This sort of thinking continued throughout the war, though. Even as the government resorted to harsher measures, they still often understood themselves to be working against a nefarious cabal, pulling the strings of power in the South, rather than a genuine popular movement. As Congress debated the first Confiscation Act, for example, Congressman Aaron Sargent of California assured his colleagues that the law would not harm Southern Unionists, those he called the, quote, victims of secession rage who now fill Southern prisons. Instead, he said, there were many Unionists in the South who were, quote, not secessionists at heart. William Kellogg of Illinois agreed, insisting that the, quote, unwitting dupes of designing men would be spared from the Confiscation Act. These assumptions were not restricted either to Army headquarters or Washington, D.C. In October of 1863, Alonzo Quint, a Union chaplain stationed with General Burnside's army in Tennessee, wrote that he believed the rebellion was based, quote, based simply on the determination of a few to continue the authority of a caste, the rule of a few educated men over a mass of whites and blacks purposely kept ignorant and poor. A month later, William Wheeler, an artillerist stationed near Chattanooga, opined that the reports he'd heard from recent deserters from the rebel army gave him hope that Southerners were finally becoming, quote, alive to the game that has been played with them. This assumption, what historians have called the deluded masses theory of the rebellion, was prevalent throughout the United States and predicated on a belief that years without true liberty of speech and press had turned the white Southern masses into unwilling pawns of slaveholders. In the example of the Copperheads, we can actually see the deluded masses theory kind of working in reverse. We've heard of Northerners describe their Southern enemies as victims, deluded, and poor. And I'd like to contrast this rhetoric with what's used to describe the anti-war faction of the Northern Democratic Party, commonly dubbed the Copperheads. Because it's not hard to find Union soldiers recording their desire to bring the war home and root out the Copperhead traitors that they believed were undermining the war effort. For example, one Ohio soldier complained that, quote, there is nothing but vile Copperheads and scoundrels and cowards back home, and woe to them when the soldiers return. Iowa soldier William Clayton was sure that any Copperhead would be roughly used if he fell within the clutches of the soldiers. Writing about his impression of public sentiment in the Army, Clayton declared, quote, there is 10 times the hatred towards the Northern traitors than there is towards those who are in arms against us. Now, it's certainly no surprise that soldiers would dislike folks from the home front they think are undermining them, but why should that hatred exceed their enmity for the Southern rebels? Put another way, assuming Clayton is right about the sentiment of the men around him, why would Northerners hate political rabble-rousers in the North more than the traitors who are actually trying to shoot them? And, in theory, distaste for traitors and the enemy could coexist in equal measure. But again, I think that their belief in this deluded masses theory is why. Common white Southerners, again, they're enemies, sure, but theoretically they could be reasoned with. Once they understood how they had been deceived by the enslavers, they would surely cease their attacks upon the Union. The Copperheads, however, have no such defense. They are Northerners who presumably enjoy the vaunted freedom of free speech and of press, and if they are still rebel sympathizers, well, then they must be unredeemable. This belief, the belief that years of pro-slavery misinformation had left white Southerners susceptible to secessionist lies, helped make Northerners more sympathetic to actual armed rebels than anti-war Democrats in some cases. As the 1864 election got into gear, the Republican press showed a particular interest in connecting their Democratic opponents with the Southern censorship of the antebellum years. The gag rule had been supported by many of the Democratic Party, and Southern Democrats had also been responsible for the egregious anti-abolition laws. Attacks like Lovejoy's murder were consistent with the Democratic Party's anti-abolitionist politics, and the leader of the sack of Lawrence had been former Democratic Senator David Atchison. So during the 1864 election, Northern Democrats tried to make the alleged censorship and press suppression of the Lincoln administration. The Democrats tried to make this a major campaign issue. But the Republicans threw back these charges with gusto. Quote, an organ of the Democratic Party should have little to say about free speech, free press, wrote the Hartford Courant in September 1864. Quote, the Democratic Party has never, when it had the power, allowed free speech or a free press. The Pittsburgh Commercial agreed, writing, quote, "Democrats have always claimed the right to speak as they please, but with marvelous inconsistency denied it to their opponents." Clearly, the legal restrictions on violence of the last 30 years had not been forgotten. Republican partisans remembered it well, and they expected that their readers would also. As the war dragged on, it became clear that, or should have become clear, that many Southerners were in fact quite earnest in their secession sympathies. And belief in the deluded masses theory, however, remained a mainstream position. In June of 1864, the New York Times predicted that with further military success, quote, "the Southern people will realize the utter folly of further opposition and consent to peaceful reunion." That September, the Sacramento Union newspaper was still blaming the war on the, quote, "guilty ambition of a, quote, minority of traitors." Even the calamity of Lincoln's assassination could not reverse these ingrained assumptions. Senator Zachariah Chandler advised President Andrew Johnson to, quote, "only hang a few of these traitors." It was Southern leaders, he said, who, quote, "have done the mischief, and the masses of the people were misled by them." At Lincoln's burial, Methodist Bishop Matthew Simpson encouraged a continuation of the martyred president's charitable policy, declaring, quote, "to the deluded masses, we will extend the arms of forgiveness." So for some, even years of desperate warfare could not force them to concede that their enemies had in fact been in earnest, that the soldiers who marched against them were not necessarily victims of a nefarious plot. It took decades of regional animosity before wars of words became battles of bullets. The complexity of the interrelating causes that led to the war are well known enough to be the butt of a joke on The Simpsons back in 1996. But I hope I've gone some way towards convincing you today that antebellum arguments about the ideal and the practice of free expression in the US played perhaps an underappreciated role in bringing on the conflict. Antebellum Americans idealized their republic, their union, as something exceptional in a world of monarchs and autocrats, a beacon of progress and liberty where the rights of all citizens were respected. Freedom of speech and freedom of the press were considered essential to this liberty. And again, as a marked contrast to the regimes of Europe where state-sponsored censorship was the norm. Americans expressed this belief in their patronage of an unprecedented number of newspapers, making access to the news of the day, even in remote corners of the frontier, a truly unique feature of their country. To reject free speech, therefore, was to betray the American liberty, align yourself not with the exceptional republic, but with the authoritarian powers that the Union defined. And when Southern lawmakers responded to abolitionist appeals in the 1830s by prescribing harsh punishments for abolitionists and banning their petitions from the Capitol, Northerners began to recoil. Although abolitionists were still absolutely the radical fringe of American politics, John Quincy Adams persuasively argued that the abolitionist message must be heard as a matter of free speech, and began making the case that authoritarian slaveholders were more dangerous than these abolitionist radicals. The murder of Elijah Lovejoy helped build this case. Even those with no affection for the abolitionists could not condone the murder of a man of God simply for speaking his mind. Pro-slavery violence in the wake of the Kansas-Nebraska Act further solidified the Southern reputation for intolerance. Pro-slavery mobs ransacked a town, condemning the local newspapers as public nuisances, scattering their type in the street and dumping their presses in the river. When a Northern lawmaker condemned this violence, a Southern congressman responded by assaulting him, spilling his blood in the Senate chambers for the crime of speaking out against the pro-slavery vagabonds. Slaveholders, it seemed, were not content to limit the freedom of their own citizens. They were determined to restrict Northerners' ability to criticize slavery as well, and physically attack them if they defied this demand. When some Southern states, began to announce their secession from the Union, Northerners faced an existential question. Was treason really so popular among their countrymen? Was slavery really so important that white Southerners, even those with no slaves of their own, were willing to go to war over the election of an anti-slavery president? Northerners developed a popular explanation that explained away this problem. Years of slaveholder dominance in the South had made free speech a dead article for decades. For years and years, they told themselves, Southern yeomen have only heard what the slaveholders allow them to hear. None of them has ever heard a good faith critique of the slave system. None of them realize how their leaders have kept them blind and ignorant. Therefore, it's not Southerners that must be defeated, but rather the slaveholder class. For once the lies and deceit the enslavers have been made known to them, surely common white Southerners would join the North in overthrowing a system that kept them ignorant and impoverished. And this, as I've hopefully summarized, this belief that if only the Northerners could disenthrall the deluded masses of the South, the war would still end, would soon end. This thinking guided Northern leadership throughout the war. Although generals like William Sherman are well known for adopting hard war tactics, bringing the fight to civilians, Sherman is notable in part because he was such an outlier. Many others, including key Republican leaders like Senator Zachariah Chandler, remained convinced to the end of the war that secession was really the brainchild of a cabal of enslavers puppeteering their region. Going to war against people you regard as allies, countrymen, friends, requires a powerful story to explain how things went so wrong. What Northerners saw as Southern elites' rejection of freedom of speech played a key supporting role in the narrative that led them to war. Slavers' willingness to excise a core constitutional right was just downright un-American in the mind of many Northerners. Their desire of enslavers to manipulate common yeomen into attacking their own government showed them to just be another iteration of the old world nobility, haughty would-be aristocrats, leeches in society who would destroy the American experiment in self-government if only they could. For white Northerners, defeating the enslavers and ending the slave system that gave those enslavers power would not just mean freedom for 4 million in bondage, but freedom for themselves as well. Eliminating a malignant force that sought to rob Northerners of the crucial rights that their forefathers had won for them. Going to war against your countrymen requires a powerful story, and a story in which Northerners cast themselves as the redeemers of American civilization. Thank you.